She raised her champagne glass, looked directly into his eyes, and called him her business partner in front of 400 people who worked for me. The room applauded. I applauded. Then they danced, his hand at the small of her back, right there on the floor of the ballroom I had rented with money my own company made. And nobody noticed my hands were perfectly steady around my glass. What none of them knew, what she didn't know, was that 6 months earlier I had already given away the ground she thought she was standing on. By Monday, he wouldn't have an office to walk into. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did she. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 47 years old, and the company those 400 people were celebrating that night, Webb Industrial Solutions, carries my name because I built it, literally, with my own hands, starting in a rented garage bay in Joliet, Illinois, in 2003. I need you to understand what that company actually was before I tell you what happened to it. Because the betrayal only makes sense once you understand the scale of what was being taken. I was 26 when I signed the lease on that garage. $11,000 in savings, a welding certification, and a belief that I could fabricate parts faster and cheaper than the shops the automotive suppliers were already using. I worked 18-hour days for 3 years. I slept on a cot in the back office more nights than I slept in my own bed. I drove the delivery truck myself when we couldn't afford a second driver. By 2008, we had 14 employees. By 2015, we'd built a 40,000-square-foot facility off Route 30. By last year, Webb Industrial Solutions employed 412 people and generated $83 million in annual revenue. I'm telling you these numbers not to impress you, but so you feel the weight of what I'm about to describe, almost losing. I met my wife, Diane, in 2011. She was working business development for one of our vendor partners, sharp, magnetic, the kind of person whose confidence makes you assume she already knows something you don't. I hired her as VP of Strategic Partnerships in 2014. It was the right business decision. She was genuinely brilliant at it. We married in 2016. For years, we ran that company as a real team. Her out front building relationships, me keeping the floor running, and the promises we made to clients kept. In 2018, I gave her 20% equity, freely, because I believed she'd earned it. I don't regret that. What I regret is not paying closer attention to what came after. About 10 months before the gala, a man named Gregory Aldrich joined our executive team as a strategic consultant. Brought in, she told me, to modernize our supply chain reporting. He was 41, sharply dressed, quick with a joke, quicker with praise for Diane in front of the board. Slowly, the language around the office started to shift. Projects that used to carry my name started appearing in memos credited to leadership, a word that had quietly stopped including me. I told myself it was nothing. A man who'd spent 21 years building something from a garage bay had earned the right to trust his own wife without auditing her calendar. I want you to understand I didn't go looking for betrayal. But somewhere in those months, a particular coldness crept into how Diane spoke to me in front of staff. The tone people use when they've already started mentally replacing you and are simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The gala was Diane's idea. She'd spent months planning it, called it a celebration of everything we've built together. And I believed her, because I wanted to. I had no idea, standing under that gold lighting with a glass of champagne in my hand, that the we she meant no longer included me. I raised that glass and toasted the woman I loved as she introduced another man to my own employees as her partner. And I smiled, because 21 years of building something teaches you a particular kind of stillness. It teaches you how to hold your face steady while something inside your chest quietly, permanently, closes a door. The thing about building a company from nothing is that it rewires how you experience trust. When you've slept in a garage office because you couldn't afford rent on 2 places, when you've personally guaranteed a loan against your own house to make payroll during a slow quarter in 2009, trust stops being an abstract virtue and becomes a working tool, something you extend carefully, and only after someone has proven they can carry the weight of it. Diane proved it for years. I want to be fair to her, even now. When I hired her in 2014, she walked into rooms with automotive supply chain executives who had run circles around every business development person we'd sent before her, and she didn't just hold her own. She reshaped the terms of the conversation. She landed us a 3-year contract with a Tier 1 supplier that stabilized our revenue through a downturn that put 2 of our competitors out of business entirely. I was proud of her in a way that had nothing to do with being her husband and everything to do with being her business partner. We married in October of 2016 at a small ceremony at a lodge near Starved Rock. 60 guests, most of them employees who'd become closer to family than my own relatives were. My brother Daniel stood up as my best man. Daniel is 3 years younger than me, quieter, the kind of person who's spent his whole life being underestimated in rooms because he doesn't perform confidence the way Diane and Gregory would later learn to. Daniel had worked in our accounting department since 2012. Methodical, unglamorous, the person who actually understood where every dollar in the company came from and where it went. Nobody at the gala that night thought to look twice at Daniel. That would turn out to matter enormously. For the first few years of our marriage, the company thrived because Diane and I genuinely operated as a unit. She traveled to trade shows in Detroit and Toronto and brought back deals I couldn't have closed myself. I kept the floor running. In 2018, when our accountant ran the numbers on a restructuring to formalize equity among senior leadership, I gave Diane 20% ownership without a second thought. It felt less like a gift and more like an acknowledgement of something already true. The change, looking back on it honestly, didn't happen all at once. It happened the way erosion happens, invisible in any single week, undeniable across those 10 months. Gregory Aldrich came to us through a supply chain software vendor Diane had worked with in her previous role. He was introduced as a consultant who could help modernize our reporting systems, something our IT infrastructure genuinely needed. His first few months were unremarkable in the way competent people are unremarkable. He did the work, the systems improved, nobody complained. What I noticed, slowly, was how the language around the office began to shift. Diane started saying, "Gregory and I think," in meetings where she used to simply say, "I think." Initiatives that used to carry my name, the Route 30 expansion, the automation upgrade on Line 4, started appearing in memos credited to leadership, a word that had quietly stopped including me by name. I remember a specific Tuesday in February, 9 months before the gala. I walked past the glass-walled conference room we used for strategy sessions and saw Diane and Gregory inside, alone, at 7:40 in the evening, long after most of the staff had gone home. She was laughing at something he'd said, her whole posture loose in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I stood in the hallway for maybe 4 seconds. Then I kept walking to my truck because I told myself, the way you tell yourself things you need to be true, that 2 colleagues working late on a Tuesday wasn't evidence of anything, but the pattern kept accumulating. A calendar invite for a strategy dinner in Naperville that I later learned Gregory had expensed as a client meeting, though our client list showed nothing scheduled that night. A comment from Rhonda, our longest-tenured office manager, who'd known me since I hired her in 2006, and who pulled me aside one afternoon by the break room and said quietly, "Marcus, I don't know what's going on, but you should probably be paying attention to some things." When I asked what she meant, she just shook her head, said, "I've said too much already," and walked away. Rhonda, who missed nothing in 20 years of running that front office, had just told me everything she was willing to say out loud. I didn't confront Diane. Part of it was fear, the specific fear of a man who's built his entire adult identity around a company and a marriage, understanding that pulling one thread might unravel both at once. Part of it was something closer to grief arriving early, a sense that whatever I found, I already half knew, and saying it out loud would only make undeniable what I still had the luxury of doubting. So instead, quietly, without telling anyone except my brother and an attorney in Chicago I trusted completely, I began making arrangements. Not out of vengeance, not yet. Simply out of the same instinct that had kept Webb Industrial Solutions alive through 2 recessions. The instinct to protect what I'd built before I fully understood what, or who, was threatening it. The grand ballroom at the Reserve on Route 59 in Naperville had been booked for 8 months, and Diane had personally overseen every detail. The gold uplighting along the walls, the ice sculpture shaped like our company logo, the live jazz trio she'd hired from downtown Chicago. 412 employees, plus spouses, plus board members and key vendor partners, filled a room that smelled like warm candle wax and expensive perfume, and the particular electricity of people dressed better than they usually get to dress for work. I wore the navy suit Diane had picked out for me 3 weeks earlier, standing in our closet with her head tilted, studying me the way she used to study contract language. "This one," she'd said, holding the jacket against my chest. "You'll look like exactly what you are." I hadn't thought at the time to ask her what she meant by that. We arrived together, her hand resting lightly on my forearm, and for the first 15 minutes it felt like the old version of us, greeting the machinists and their wives, thanking Rhonda for the seating chart, laughing with 2 longtime clients from a Detroit parts distributor who'd flown in for the occasion. I remember thinking, standing there with a glass of champagne, sweating faintly in my hand, that maybe I had imagined the worst of it. Maybe 18 months of quiet accumulation had been exactly what I'd told myself it was. Nothing. Then Gregory arrived, and something in the room's temperature shifted, the way a kitchen shifts when the oven door opens. He wore a charcoal suit that fit with the kind of precision that suggested a tailor rather than a rack, and he moved through the room with an ease that made our shop floor culture look almost quaint by comparison. Men who'd spent 20 years with grease under their fingernails standing a little straighter as he shook their hands and remembered, somehow, all their names. I watched Diane's face when she saw him enter. I'd spent 21 years learning to read that face across negotiating tables and late nights over spreadsheets. And what I saw wasn't the face of a woman greeting a colleague. It was the face of a woman who'd been waiting for a particular person to walk into a room. Dinner passed in a blur of toasts. Rhonda's speech about company history that got genuine tears from half the room, a board member's remarks about our expansion into the Milwaukee market, my own brief words of gratitude to the people who built this with their hands, which drew warm applause, and I noticed no particular reaction from Diane at all. Then, near the end of the evening, Diane stood, tapped her champagne glass with a fork, and asked for everyone's attention. 21 years ago, she began, her voice carrying easily through the ballroom sound system. My husband started this company in a garage, with nothing but a welding certification and more determination than sense. Warm laughter. My chest tightened slightly, some old instinct sensing what was coming before my mind could name it. But no company grows without the right people finding their way into it at the right time. She turned, and her eyes found Gregory across the room. I want to recognize someone who has become an essential part of how we think about the future of this business. Gregory Aldrich has been, over this past year, nothing short of a true business partner to me. The word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. A small sound, followed by ripples that kept moving outward. 400 people applauded. I applauded. My hands moved of their own accord, some deeply trained instinct toward composure taking over from whatever part of me had just gone quiet and cold inside my chest. Diane crossed the floor, took Gregory's hand, and as the jazz trio shifted into something slow, they began to dance. Right there in the center of the ballroom I had rented, under lighting I had approved the invoice for, in front of employees whose paychecks I had personally signed for 2 decades. I stood near the bar with my champagne glass, watching my wife rest her head briefly against another man's shoulder, while 400 people who worked for me clapped along to the rhythm. Rhonda appeared at my elbow, her face carefully neutral. "You all right, Marcus?" she asked quietly. "Never better," I said, and I meant it in a way I don't think she understood, and I didn't yet fully understand myself. Later, near the coat check, Diane found me alone for a moment, her cheeks flushed from champagne and dancing. "You're not being petty about this, are you?" she asked, not quite looking at me, adjusting an earring instead. "Gregory's brought so much to the company. I need you to be gracious about this, Marcus. It matters to me." I looked at her face and searched it for something. Guilt, maybe, or the flicker of a woman aware she'd just done something cruel. What I found instead was calm, certainty, the specific expression of someone who has already made her decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. "I'm always gracious," I told her, and I smiled, and I meant that too, in a way that would become clear to both of us by Monday morning. The truth is, I started paying real attention that Thursday evening in March, 8 months before the gala, though the erosion itself had been building for months before that, ever since Gregory arrived. It was a Thursday evening in early March when I finally stopped explaining things away. I'd stayed late at the Route 30 facility to walk the floor with our production manager, checking on a new automated welding cell we'd installed on Line 4. It was nearly 8 o'clock when I walked back through the executive wing to grab my laptop bag, and I heard voices coming from the glass-walled conference room we used for strategy sessions. Diane's voice, low and warm, and Gregory's, easy and confident in that particular register men use when they know a woman is listening closely. I didn't mean to stop. I told myself that afterward more than once. But I stood in the hallway, my laptop bag over one shoulder, and I heard Diane say, "I think we present it to the board as an efficiency initiative. If Marcus's name isn't attached to it, they'll actually evaluate it on the merits, instead of just deferring to him because he built the place." A pause. Gregory's laugh, quiet and complicit. "He built it 20 years ago," Gregory said. "Sometimes the person who builds something isn't the person who should still be steering it." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably closer to 10 seconds. Then I walked to my truck in the parking lot, sat behind the wheel in the dark, and didn't start the engine for nearly 20 minutes. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the anger did. What I felt first wasn't rage. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific disorientation of hearing your own life described from outside it, as though you're eavesdropping on a stranger's assessment of a man you thought you knew. Gregory wasn't wrong, exactly, that companies sometimes outgrow their founders. What made my chest go cold was the casualness of it. The way my wife had discussed dissolving my role in my own company with the same tone she'd used to discuss a vendor contract that had simply run its natural course. I didn't confront her that night. I drove home. And when she asked how the floor walkthrough had gone, I told her the welding cell was running beautifully. And I meant it. Because some part of me had already begun compartmentalizing the two versions of my life into separate rooms. The following week, I called my brother. Daniel and I met at a diner off Route 6 in Morris, a place neither of us had any professional reason to be seen, booth seats with cracked red vinyl and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. Daniel had worked in our accounting department for 12 years by then, And if there was one person in the world who understood the actual bones of Webb Industrial Solutions, not the version presented to the board, but the real structure underneath it, it was him. "I think Diane wants me out," I told him. And saying it out loud for the first time made something in my chest finally settle into a shape I could work with. Daniel didn't look surprised, which told me something on its own. "I've seen some of the memos," he said carefully. "The language has been changing. Initiatives that used to have your name on them don't anymore." He turned his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "What do you want to do?" "I want to sell you my shares," I said. 60%, structured through a trust with our attorney handling everything discreetly. I keep operational control on paper until we decide otherwise, but the ownership moves to someone I trust completely." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus, that's not a small thing. That changes everything about how the company is controlled." He paused. "What about Diane's 20? And the employee pool?" "Diane keeps hers. She earned that fair and square, and I'm not touching it," I said. "The other 20% stays exactly where it's been since 2019, in the employee ownership trust we set up for the senior floor staff. That was never mine to move, and it's not what this is about. This is about the 60% that's currently sitting in my name, doing nothing but making people assume things about who's actually in charge." "That's the point," I said. "Right now, on paper, I still look like the majority owner everyone assumes I am. But if things go the direction I think they're going, I want to make sure that whoever's making decisions about my future in that building actually has the legal authority to make them." We met with our attorney, Patricia Chen, who had handled our corporate structuring since 2015 3 times over the following 2 months. The transaction was clean, legal, and quiet. My 60% ownership sold to Daniel through a properly structured buy-sell agreement, funded through a combination of his savings and a note secured against future company distributions, reviewed and approved by our board's finance committee, who saw it as routine internal restructuring for tax and estate planning purposes. Diane was not on that finance committee. She never asked a single question about it, because by that point, she'd stopped paying attention to anything about the company that didn't involve Gregory's name attached to it. By the time the Gala's gold uplighting went up on those ballroom walls, 6 months after that afternoon in Patricia's office, I no longer legally owned the company everyone in that room believed I did. I was, on paper, an employee. The founder, still respected, still drawing a salary, but no longer the man whose signature carried final authority over who worked there and who didn't. Diane didn't know that, and she never once thought to check. Monday morning arrived the way most consequential mornings do, quietly, without announcing itself, disguised as an ordinary Monday. I got to the Route 30 facility at 6:45, earlier than usual, because I wanted to walk the floor before the office wing filled up. The parking lot lights were still on against the gray November sky, and the air smelled like cold metal and machine oil, a smell I had loved since 2003 and never once grown tired of. I said good morning to 3 second-shift welders finishing up, checked in with our production manager about the new automated line, and made my way toward the executive wing around 7:30. That's when I saw the moving boxes. There were 4 of them, stacked neatly outside the office at the end of the hallway. The corner office. The one with the good windows facing the equipment yard. The one that had sat empty since our former VP of operations retired in the spring. Gregory was standing beside them in a gray overcoat, holding a coffee cup from the shop down the street, chatting easily with 2 men in dark polo shirts I recognized immediately as the private security firm we contracted for after-hours facility monitoring. "Morning, Marcus," Gregory said, and there was something in his tone, a faint, unearned familiarity, the tone of a man who believes he has already secured a promotion he hasn't formally been told about yet. "Guess I'm your new neighbor down the hall." I looked at the boxes, at the security guards, at Gregory's easy posture, and I felt something settle into place inside my chest, calm and clear. The way a machine settles into alignment after you've spent hours calibrating it. "Is that right?" I said. Not a question. An observation. "Diane mentioned she'd loop you in on the details," Gregory said, sipping his coffee. "Chief Strategy Officer, effective today. I know it's a big shift, but I think you'll find I bring a lot of value to how this place runs going forward." I said nothing for a moment. Some small, tired part of me almost let it happen, almost turned and walked to my own office and let the machinery of what I'd built 6 months earlier simply run its course without my involvement. But I'd spent 21 years personally signing every paycheck in that building, and some things you owe the people who trust you enough to say plainly, in person. "Gregory," I said, "I think there's been a miscommunication. You'll want to talk to security before you unpack anything." His easy expression flickered, just slightly. "I'm sorry?" That's when Ray Delgado, the head of our contracted security team, stepped forward. A man I'd known for 8 years, who'd personally trained on our facility's protocols since we first brought private security on after a break-in attempt in 2016. "Mr. Aldrich," Delgado said, his voice professionally flat. "I've been asked to inform you that your consulting contract with Webb Industrial Solutions was terminated as of Friday at close of business. I'll need you to gather your personal belongings from the conference room where you've been working, and I'll walk you out." Gregory's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A rapid, almost comic sequence of expressions. Confusion sliding into disbelief, sliding into a kind of scrambling calculation, as though he were mentally reviewing every conversation of the past 6 months for the moment the ground had shifted beneath him. "This has to be a mistake," he said. "Diane approved this. She's the majority." "Diane owns 20% of this company," I said quietly. "She has for 8 years. She's never owned a majority of anything here." I watched something in his face genuinely collapse. The particular expression of a man who has built an entire strategy on an assumption he never bothered to verify. "That's not," he started, then stopped, then pulled out his phone, already dialing. I didn't wait to watch the rest. I walked to my office, closed the door, and sat down at my desk for exactly 4 minutes before Diane called. "Marcus, what is going on?" she said, her voice already sharp with panic, the careful composure I'd watched her wear for months, cracking audibly in real time. "Security just walked Gregory out of the building, in front of everyone. Do you understand what you've just done?" "I haven't done anything," I said, and it was, in its own way, entirely true. His consulting contract expired. Security enforced the terms of a contract that ended Friday. I gave him that office. I told him he'd be Chief Strategy Officer starting today, Diane, I said, and I made my voice as gentle as I could manage. You don't have the authority to make that appointment. You never have. You own 20% of Webb Industrial Solutions. You always have. There was a long silence on the line, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, the sound of someone doing frantic mental arithmetic and arriving again and again at numbers that refused to add up the way she needed them to. "What did you do?" she said finally, her voice very quiet now, all the sharpness drained out of it. 6 months ago, I said, I sold my shares to Daniel. 60%, structured through a trust, approved by the finance committee. You never asked. I assumed at the time that you simply trusted me. I understand now that you'd simply stopped paying attention. The company did not fall apart quietly, and I want to be honest that I take no pleasure in describing what happened next, even though every piece of it had been set in motion long before that Monday morning, by decisions Diane and Gregory had made without me, and, as it turned out, without full honesty toward each other either. By Tuesday, word had traveled through all 412 employees the way word does in a building where people have worked alongside each other for decades. Not through any official announcement, but through the accumulated, unstoppable momentum of shift-change conversations and break-room whispers. Rhonda told me later that by lunchtime Monday, half the administrative staff already knew Gregory had been escorted out by security, and by Tuesday morning, most of them had pieced together why. Daniel called an emergency finance committee meeting Wednesday, not to punish Diane, but because the board needed clarity on ownership structure before rumors calcified into something clients might catch wind of. Diane attended. Daniel told me afterward she sat through it with a composure that impressed even him, asking clear questions, taking notes, behaving, in his words, like someone still trying to find the floor under her feet. What came out during that meeting, and in the weeks that followed, was worse for her than the ownership transfer alone. It turned out Gregory's consulting contract, the one Delgado had correctly identified as terminated, had never actually been renewed by anyone with legitimate signing authority. Diane had verbally extended it, had told Gregory his title change was approved, had even had HR draft an offer letter for the Chief Strategy Officer role, a letter that had never been formally executed because it required a signature from either myself or, as of 6 months earlier, Daniel. Diane had simply assumed the paperwork would follow the verbal commitment, the way things had always followed her intentions before, back when her confidence alone had been enough to move things inside that building. Worse, our internal audit, the one Daniel ordered immediately out of pure procedural caution rather than suspicion, turned up something none of us had anticipated. Gregory had been expensing personal costs to a corporate card issued under his consulting agreement. 4 dinners at a restaurant in Naperville that had never been client meetings. A hotel stay in Milwaukee during a week when no business trip had been scheduled. A set of golf clubs purchased at a pro shop and coded as Client Relationship Development. Just over $11,000, accumulated over 5 months. None of it ever reviewed by anyone with actual signing power because, functionally, for those 5 months, nobody had been checking. Gregory, once confronted with the audit findings by our attorney, did not handle it with the polish he'd worn so easily at the gala. He claimed, first, that the expenses were legitimate business development costs. When shown the restaurant receipts corresponding to nights his own calendar showed no client listed, he pivoted to claiming Diane had authorized personal spending as compensation for additional strategic work outside his contract scope. Work he couldn't specifically describe when Patricia Chen asked him to. The board terminated his consulting relationship entirely in writing and referred the expense findings to corporate counsel to determine whether restitution would be pursued. Diane's position became something the board had to address directly, and this was the part Daniel told me was hardest to watch. She hadn't committed fraud herself. She owned 20% of the company legitimately. She'd never taken money that wasn't hers, but she'd repeatedly made representations to staff and to a vendor consultant about authority she didn't possess. And she'd done so, the finance committee concluded, either through a serious misunderstanding of her own role or through a willful disregard for the actual governance structure of the company she'd helped build. Either explanation, laid out in a boardroom in front of people who had once genuinely respected her, was its own kind of public reckoning. She was not fired. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in a story like this one. She retained her 20% ownership, and her formal title remained hers, because there was no legal basis to remove her from a role she held legitimately. But something in how the building related to her changed permanently after that week. Rhonda told me Diane's calendar, once full of strategy sessions that had eaten so many evenings, emptied out considerably. Clients who'd once specifically requested her began asking more often to loop in someone else. The particular currency she'd spent years accumulating, the sense that she was the person in the room whose word moved things, had been spent entirely, in the space of 1 week, on a man who couldn't tell the finance committee, when asked directly, whether the golf clubs had ever actually been given to a client at all. I did not speak to Diane again for nearly 3 weeks after that Monday morning phone call. We were by then effectively living separate lives inside the same house. I slept in the guest room. I went to work, walked the floor, signed the paychecks I was, once again, unambiguously entitled to sign. I watched the company steady itself, employees returning to the ordinary rhythms of their work, the specific gossip of that week slowly giving way to newer, smaller concerns. And somewhere in that quiet, unglamorous stretch of November evenings, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, I understood that I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, exhausted. And beneath the exhaustion, a grief I hadn't fully let myself feel yet, for the version of my marriage I had believed was true for far longer than it actually had been. Diane moved out in early December into a rental condo in Naperville, close to the office. A decision we reached without lawyers in the room, sitting across from each other at our own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with the November light going gray outside the window. There was no shouting. I think we were both, by then, too tired for it. "I don't know when I stopped seeing you as someone who built this," she said that afternoon, turning her coffee cup slowly the way Daniel had turned his at that diner months earlier. "I think somewhere along the way, I started seeing you as just the foundation, something solid you build on top of, not something you still have to pay attention to." "And Gregory paid attention," I said. Not cruelly, just naming it. "Gregory made me feel like the smartest person in every room," she said quietly. "You'd stopped needing me to feel that from you a long time ago, because you already knew what I was worth. I think I mistook his need for something more important than your certainty." She looked down at her hands. "That was never fair to you. I understand that now." We finalized the divorce in the spring, quiet and uncontested, exactly as our attorney had predicted it would be once the ownership question had already been settled months earlier by decisions I'd made long before either of us sat down to divide anything. Diane kept her 20% stake in Webb Industrial Solutions. I never once considered fighting her for it, because she'd earned that equity honestly, years before Gregory Aldrich ever walked through our doors. She resigned from VP role 4 months after the gala, not because anyone forced her to, but because, she told me over coffee near the courthouse the day our divorce was finalized, she couldn't stand walking those halls anymore, feeling 400 people's eyes on her. She took a position at a mid-sized logistics firm in Aurora, a smaller company, a smaller stage, and I think, in a strange way, that was its own kind of consequence, one that arrived naturally once the currency she'd built her identity around had been spent. Gregory never faced criminal charges. Our attorney determined the expense misuse, while a clear breach of his consulting agreement fell below the threshold worth pursuing through the courts, and Webb Industrial Solutions settled instead for a signed restitution agreement requiring him to repay the $11,000 over 18 months. I heard, secondhand, through an industry contact, that he took a consulting position with a firm in Indianapolis within the year, and that his reputation in the Chicago manufacturing circuit had suffered enough that he no longer worked local accounts. I stopped asking, eventually, because checking on him had started to feel less like curiosity and more like a habit I didn't want to keep. Daniel remains the 60% owner of Webb Industrial Solutions today, exactly as we structured it that spring in Patricia Chen's office. Diane's 20% and the Employee Ownership Trust's 20% never moved at all through any of this. The only thing that ever changed hands was the piece that had been sitting in my name. He asked me more than once in the months that followed whether I wanted the shares transferred back now that the immediate danger had passed. I told him no every time, and I meant it. The structure had done exactly what I'd built it to do, not to punish anyone, but to ensure that whatever happened to my marriage, the company that 412 families depended on would never be governed by someone's confidence alone, mine or anyone else's. Daniel and I run it together now, in a way that feels, honestly, more honest than the years I ran it as sole owner ever did. I still walk the floor every morning. I still know every welder's name. But I've learned something about the difference between building a thing and possessing it. And I think that lesson was worth the price it cost me. I sold the house in the spring, the 4-bedroom colonial on Ashford Lane that Diane and I had bought together in 2017, and bought a smaller place near the river in Morris, close enough to the plant that I can walk there on clear mornings. I have a garden now, something I never had time for during the years the company demanded everything I had to give it. I grow tomatoes and peppers that nobody particularly admires except me, and I've found that I don't mind that at all. Diane and I speak occasionally now, mostly about logistics. There's no bitterness left in it, at least not on my end. What remains, mostly, is a kind of tired clarity. The understanding that we built something real together for a long time, and that it ended not because either of us was a villain in some simple sense, but because somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary years, she stopped seeing what she had and started reaching for something that only glittered because it was new. I am 47 years old, and I have never been more certain of what I actually built and what actually belongs to me. If you've stayed with me this long, I have to ask you something honestly. Have you ever built something, a marriage, a family, a career, and slowly realized the people around you had stopped seeing the work and started only seeing what you could still give them? Have you ever quietly protected yourself, not out of anger, but because some part of you sensed the ground shifting before you had the words to name it? I'd love to know where you land on this. Tell me in the comments. Do you think I was right to protect the company quietly, without confronting Diane directly the moment I suspected something? Or do you think honesty, spoken out loud the moment I first felt it, would have changed how this all unfolded? If this story reached something true in you, something you've been quietly carrying, please leave a word in the comments. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional experiences and fully reimagined for this telling. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.